This inverter mini split air conditioner shows an F1 error problem. As I passed electricity through it, these LED lights have started to glow. The LED 1 and 2 have started to blink. When both these LED light blinks together, this is the sign that an F1 error is shown on this motherboard. The F1 error means that the IPM is bad in normal conditions. But right now, the IPM of this motherboard is fine, because when I check it without electricity through a multimeter, it is good. Next, I will check the voltages on these two operational amplifiers installed here. It is important. I have taken a negative from this pin of the IC to check the voltages of operational amplifiers. First, I am testing the input voltages on the 8-number pin of the op-amp. 15.96 volts are flowing through this pin, which are fine. These voltages are slightly high. It should have been 15 volts, but no issue. After this, the output voltages from the op-amp are important. The 7-number pin is the output pin of this op-amp. The 7-number pin is connected with this resistor. And 2.5 volts are shown on this pin of the op-amp, which is fine. The voltages fluctuate because these are analog signals. Next is the pin number 1 of the op-amp, which is also the output pin. Let's check how many voltages are flowing on this pin. 2.5 volts are flown on this pin as well, which is fine. This means that this operational amplifier is working fine. Next, I will check the second operational amplifier. I will take the negative from the same pin to test its voltages. The pin number 1 is the output of this op-amp. This is also a 2-channel op-amp. Pin number 1 is attached to this resistor. 2.479 volts are flowing on this pin. These voltages are fine. The pin numbers 5, 6, 7, and 8 of this op-amp are very important too. The pin number 6 is joined with this capacitor. 2.283 volts are flown through this pin, which is fine. 2.6 volts are flowing through the 5-number pin, which is also fine. 5 volts should flow through the output pin, which is pin number 7. Absolutely yes, 5 volts are flowing through this pin. 5 volts are also flown across the 8-number pin of the op-amp. Both these operational amplifiers are good. They have no issue with it. Still, the F1 error is shown. Now everything in this motherboard is fine. Voltages are fine. This IPM high side is fine, so let's check the low volts pins of this IPM, because if the issue is on the low volts pins of the IPM, still the F1 error will be displayed. I have already checked 15 volts on these 3 pins. The next 3 pins are for turning on the IPM. The 5, 6, and 7-number pins are the positive voltages for turning on the IGBT. The 10, 11, and 12 are the negative pins for turning on the IGBT. These 6 capacitors have a very important role in this motherboard. Which component are they connected with? I will tell you that, but first, I am going to tell you how to test it. I will turn off the electricity. I will wait for these lights to stop blinking, and then I will test it. The LED lights have turned off, which means the capacitors have been discharged completely. Put the multimeter on continuity mode to test the capacitors. Now I am going to check these capacitors one by one. I will check the capacitors on the multimeter's continuity mode. If any of these capacitors show a short circuit, then it is going to be a big problem. These capacitors should not be short-circuited by any chance. The third capacitor is also fine. Fourth is also fine. The next is also fine, and the last capacitor is also fine. Now I am going to tell you what is the purpose of using these capacitors. The negative and positive supply go out from the microcontroller to turn on the IPM and to make the compressor run. Now the voltages go out from the MCU to the IPM. These capacitors are installed between the pins of the MCU and IPM, and these capacitors are grounded with a trace of bigger capacitors. If any capacitor gets short-circuited, then understand that the microcontroller is directly affected and is problematic. It is of no work. Always check these capacitors. These could be the reason for causing the F1 error. Sometimes, even though these capacitors are short-circuited, the microcontroller still turns on. The LED lights are turning on. The F1 error is still displayed. Next, I will test these capacitors by passing electricity through the motherboard. The motherboard has turned on again. As I told you, the voltages that come out of the MCU turn on the IPM. Then let me tell you that these capacitors should not have any voltages at initial or standby state. So let's start testing the voltages on these caps. I have set the multimeter on DC volts. Let's check one by one. No voltages on the first one. I am checking the second capacitor now, no volts here. The third capacitor has no volts. Now, the fourth capacitor. And 5 volts are flowing on this fourth capacitor. Okay, then let's check the next capacitors. No volts on the fifth capacitor. And the sixth capacitor also has no volts. The third capacitor from the right side has 5 volts flowing through it. The 5 volts on these capacitors will flow at that time when the microcontroller will understand the need to turn on the compressor. Increase or decrease the speed of the compressor. Interestingly, the company didn't use any resistor to connect the IPM and the MCU, so most of the time, this happens that when this IPM short circuits from the low volt pins. This directly affects the microcontroller. Now I will trace where are these 5 volts flowing from in that capacitor. Is it from the microcontroller or the IPM? Because if the IPM is shorted internally, still, it can cause problems. I am going to cut this trace of the capacitor where 5 volts are flowing. I have separated this connection from the trace. I will turn on this motherboard again and check how these LED lights work. The lights are still blinking in the same pattern. The capacitor is now only connected to the IPM. It is disconnected from the microcontroller. And no voltages are shown on this capacitor. Now I am going to check the volts before the capacitor where the trace has been cut. 5 volts are flowing before the capacitor. But not on the capacitor. Which means the IPM is absolutely fine. It has no issue. Which means the microcontroller has short-circuited. Click on the left or right thumbnail to watch our next videos. And subscribe. Thank you.